So, listen to this. Pedri plays football like someone who has already seen everything. Every pass feels calculated, every movement calm, like nothing can surprise him anymore. At 18, he looked like a veteran. At 19, he became one of the most important players in both Barcelona and Spain. And that's where the story should have been simple. A generational midfielder, a future legend in the making. But it didn't happen like that, because while everyone was watching how good Pedri was becoming, something else was happening in the background. Something quieter, something much harder to notice. His body was already starting to break down. So the real question isn't how good Pedri is, it's this. How did a player this young already start to fall apart? This isn't really a story about injuries, at least not in the way people usually think, because when fans talk about Pedri's injuries, they treat them like bad luck, like unfortunate timing, like something that just happens in football. But what if that's not the real story at all? What if Pedri's situation isn't random and it isn't unlucky? What if it was always going to happen the moment football decided he was ready? At first, everything about Pedri looked perfect. A quiet kid from Las Palmas who didn't rely on speed or strength, but on something much rarer. Control, intelligence, rhythm, the kind of player who doesn't just play the game, but understands it. And that's exactly why he became so important so quickly, not because Barcelona wanted to rush him, but because they needed him to fix things that were already broken. And that's where the real story begins, because this isn't about how Pedri became great, it's about what happens when a player becomes essential before he's ready to survive it. At first, Pedri wasn't supposed to be this kind of player, not this early, not at this level. He came from Las Palmas, a small club where talent doesn't usually turn into global expectation overnight. And even when Barcelona signed him, there wasn't that same noise you would hear around other young stars, no massive hype, no headlines calling him the next big thing. But then he started playing, and everything changed quietly, not through goals or flashy moments, but through something much harder to explain. He always seemed to be in the right place, always making the right decision, always slowing the game down when everyone else was rushing. And that's what made him different. Because Pedri didn't play like a teenager trying to prove himself, he played like someone who already belonged. At a time when Barcelona was losing its identity after Messi, when nothing seemed stable, Pedri became one of the few things that made sense. And it didn't take long before he wasn't just a promising talent anymore, he became necessary, the kind of player coaches trust without hesitation, the kind of player teammates rely on even if he's the youngest on the pitch. And then Spain saw the same thing, the same calmness, the same intelligence, and suddenly Pedri wasn't just playing for Barcelona, he was playing everywhere, every game, every competition, every moment that mattered. And that's where something subtle began to shift, because without anyone really noticing, Pedri stopped being a young player, developing at his own pace, and started becoming a solution to problems much bigger than him. And that's where everything started to change, not in one big moment, but in a series of small decisions that slowly added up. Because once Pedri proved he could handle the game, nobody really stopped to ask how much he should handle. Barcelona needed control in midfield, and Pedri gave them that, so he kept playing. Spain needed someone who could think under pressure, and Pedri became that player too, so he kept playing there as well. And before anyone realized it, he wasn't just part of the system anymore, he was holding it together. The 2020 to 2021 season turned into something extreme, even by modern football standards, because Pedri didn't just play a lot, he played almost everything. League matches, Champions League nights, international tournaments, it never really stopped. And then came the summer, where instead of resting, instead of recovering, he went straight into the European Championship with Spain, playing game after game against the best teams in the world. But even that wasn't the end of it, because right after the Euros, he went to the Olympics, another tournament, more matches, more minutes, more pressure on a body that was still growing. At that point, it didn't look like a problem. It looked like success, like proof that he was special. Because only special players get trusted like that, but that's the illusion football creates, because what looks like trust can quickly turn into dependence, and what feels like opportunity can quietly become overload. And Pedri didn't complain, he didn't show frustration, he just kept playing, which made it even easier for everyone around him to keep asking for more. Coaches saw consistency, fans saw brilliance, and nobody really saw the cost building underneath. And that's how the conflict really begins, not with a sudden injury, not with a dramatic collapse, but with something much more dangerous. A young player being pushed past his natural limits without anyone realizing where those limits actually were. Because by the time the first real signs appeared, by the time his body started to respond differently, it was already too late to go back to a normal development path. And this is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming real, because the moment you look closer, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. After that overloaded season, Pedri didn't just slow down, he started breaking down in a way that felt repetitive, almost predictable. It began with muscle injuries, small at first, the kind that usually go away with rest, but rest was exactly what he never really had. He would come back, play a few matches, look sharp again, and then suddenly he was out once more, the same areas, the same type of problems, as if his body was trying to send a message that nobody was fully listening to. And what made it worse wasn't just the injuries themselves, it was the context around them. Because every time Pedri returned, Barcelona looked different, less controlled, less fluid, and that immediately brought him back into the spotlight. The team needed rhythm. They needed someone to connect everything. And once again, Pedri became that solution. So even when he came back from injury, he didn't come back slowly. He came back as the answer. You could see it in the way he was used, not as a player easing his way into form, but as someone expected to immediately restore balance. And that's a dangerous position for any player, especially one who is still developing physically. There were matches where he played the full 90 minutes right after returning. Games where the tempo was high, the pressure constant, and every movement demanded precision. And the more he played, the more the cycle continued. Injury, recovery, return, responsibility, and then injury again. It didn't feel like a random series of setbacks anymore, it felt like a loop. And when you look at the numbers, it becomes even clearer. Across that period, Pedri accumulated an extraordinary number of matches for someone his age, far beyond what most players experience in such a short time. But more importantly, it wasn't just the quantity, it was the intensity, because these weren't low-pressure appearances. These were high-stakes games where every decision mattered, where every mistake was magnified. And mentally, that kind of responsibility adds another layer of fatigue, something that doesn't show up in statistics but affects how the body responds over time. There were also moments that seemed small on the surface but carried deeper meaning, like games where Pedri looked slightly off, just a fraction slower, just a little less sharp, and yet he stayed on the pitch because there was no real alternative. Teammates trusted him, coaches depended on him, and that expectation quietly removed the option of stepping back. And this is where quotes and reactions around him start to reveal something important. Coaches praised his maturity, calling him intelligent, composed, reliable, words that sound positive, but also suggest something else, that he was being treated like a finished product rather than a developing player. Even opponents recognized how central he was, often focusing their pressing around him, knowing that if they disrupted Pedri, they could disrupt the entire system. And that level of attention adds even more strain because it forces him into constant decision-making under pressure, constant movement to escape marking, constant involvement in every phase of play. Then there were the big games, the matches where everything slowed down and Pedri still stood out, controlling tempo against top teams, showing glimpses of what he could truly become. But those moments also reinforced the same cycle, because every great performance increased the belief that he could handle more. And football rarely knows when to stop once it finds something that works. So instead of protecting him, it leaned into him even harder. And the result is what we see now, not a single catastrophic injury, but a series of recurring problems that hint at something deeper, something structural. Because when injuries repeat in the same patterns over and over again, it stops being about bad luck and starts becoming about load, about recovery, about the invisible limits that were crossed long before anyone acknowledged them. And what makes this even more complicated is that Pedri himself never changed the way he plays. He didn't become reckless. He didn't rely on physicality. He stayed the same intelligent, controlled midfielder. Which raises an even more uncomfortable question. If nothing about his style explains the injuries, then maybe the problem isn't how he plays, but how often he's been asked to play and how early he was pushed into carrying that weight. And this is where the story changes completely, because up until now, it's easy to think this is just another case of a young player dealing with injuries. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe that explanation. Because Pedri isn't breaking down in the way fragile players usually do. He's not someone whose game depends on explosive speed or constant physical duels. He's the opposite, a player built on intelligence, positioning, and control. And yet, he's the one constantly dealing with physical setbacks. So the problem can't just be his body, it has to be something else. And that something else is much harder to admit because it points directly at the system around him. Pedri didn't just become important too quickly, he became essential at a time when Barcelona was rebuilding and Spain was searching for stability. And when a player becomes essential, especially that young, the rules change. Development stops being a priority and survival becomes the focus. Every match matters, every competition matters, and suddenly there is no perfect moment to rest, no safe window to protect him, because the team always feels like it needs him right now. And that's the real shift in this story. Pedri wasn't unlucky, he was necessary. And necessity in football is dangerous because once a team believes it cannot function without you, it stops thinking about what's best for you long term. It only thinks about what you can give in the moment. And over time, that creates a quiet kind of damage. Not something explosive or dramatic, but something that builds slowly, match after match, season after season. So maybe the real issue was never Pedri's body. Maybe the real issue is that football asked him to become something too early and never gave him the chance to grow into it at his own pace. And once you step back, this stops being just Pedri's story and starts looking like a pattern that football has repeated for years. Because Pedri isn't the first young player to face this kind of pressure, and he definitely won't be the last. Modern football has changed in a way that makes situations like this almost inevitable. The calendar is more demanding than ever with club competitions, international tournaments, and constant travel, leaving very little space for recovery. And at the same time, the game has become faster, more intense, more physically demanding, even for players who rely on intelligence rather than strength. But the biggest change isn't physical, it's psychological. Young players today are no longer given time to grow quietly. They are identified early, promoted quickly, and expected to perform immediately at the highest level. And when that happens, the line between potential and responsibility disappears. Players like Rooney, like Michael Owen, even more recent cases, all showed signs of brilliance very early, and all of them carried expectations that their bodies struggled to keep up with over time. And now you can see similar risks in players like Gavi, where the same pattern is beginning to form. Constant minutes, constant pressure, constant reliance. And the problem is, football doesn't really have a mechanism to slow this down once it starts. Clubs need results, national teams need success, fans demand consistency, and media narratives amplify every performance. So when a young player proves he can deliver, the system doesn't protect him. It leans on him even more. And that's what makes Pedri's situation so uncomfortable to watch, because it feels familiar. It feels like something we've seen before, just with a different name, a different face, but the same underlying story. A young talent rising too fast, becoming too important, and carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried that early. And this is the part that makes the whole story feel heavier, because by now, it's no longer just about what has already happened, it's about what might never happen. Every time Pedri returns from injury, there's a moment of hope, a sense that maybe this time things will be different, maybe this time he'll finally have the rhythm, the continuity, the space to grow into the player everyone believes he can become. And in those first few matches back, you can see it again, the same calmness, the same intelligence, the same ability to control the tempo of the game like very few players can. It reminds you why he was so special in the first place. But then, just as quickly, the doubt returns. Another absence, another setback, another pause in a career that was supposed to move forward without interruption. And that cycle begins to change how people see him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Instead of asking how great he will become, the question shifts to whether he will ever reach that level at all. And that's what makes this situation so uncomfortable, because the fear isn't that Pedri won't be a good player, it's that he might never become the player he was meant to be. That the version of Pedri we saw at the beginning, the one who looked effortless, almost inevitable, might have been only a glimpse of something we never get to see fully realized. And in football, that's one of the hardest things to accept. Not failure, but potential that slowly fades before it ever truly peaks. And maybe that's why Pedri's story feels different, because it doesn't have a clear ending yet. He's still young, still talented, still capable of becoming one of the best midfielders of his generation. Nothing is decided, nothing is final. But at the same time, there's something fragile about the way his career has unfolded so far, something that makes it hard to ignore what we've already seen. Because football has a history of stories like this. Players who showed too much too early, who carried too much too soon, and who never quite became what they were supposed to be. And the uncomfortable truth is, those stories don't usually announce themselves when they begin. They look like success. They feel like progress. Until one day, you realize something has been lost along the way. So maybe the real question isn't whether Pedri will recover or whether he will come back stronger. Maybe the real question is much simpler and much harder to answer. Has football given Pedri everything he needs to become great, or has it already taken too much from him before he even had the chance?